We still do 7 NUFC Matters shows for free a week. But if you want to support the channel, there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast or video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications option. Hit the thanks button to buy a super sticker. You can do this on the live chat too. You can also join our Patreon page or buy us a coffee at the link in all of our video descriptions below. We are also looking for sponsors. If you want our latest advertising rates and how you can get involved, then email John at nufcmatters1892@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.
Hush now, city kids, gather round for urban myths. Hush now, city kids. When it came to me after so long, I didn't have no choices in the streets where I was from. When I think about the pain, I didn't have no choices. I took what I had sworn. Hush now, city kids, gather round for urban myths. Hush now, city kids. But you know, the wouldn't let you have it any other way.
Good morning. I've gone for a shorter intro because Ben hasn't got much time as usual. Ben, how are you, mate?
Good morning. Good to be back live here from Philadelphia, where it's actually 6 a.m. So there's a bit of commitment to Newcastle United.
Fantastic. Great to have you back on, mate. My diary, your diary has just been so hectic of recent months. We haven't been able to catch up. But let's just get straight into transfers because I know we're going to have you back on later in the month and we can chat a little bit more about Newcastle's season on that show. Everybody in the chat is asking lots of questions. We probably won't get through all of them. Where do we start, really? Let me start with Marc Guehi, because Marc Guehi was somebody Newcastle tracked last year. We had the backwards and forwards between owner and, the media. It was quite clear Palace didn't want to let him go, weren't keen on doing business with Newcastle unless it was an inflated price. He's got a year left now on his contract. Newcastle have been linked with him heavily. Is Marc Guehi potentially, do you think, in your opinion, do you think he could come to Newcastle in this summer window?
Yeah, obviously Palace got European football at the moment. We'll have to wait and see what happens with Nottingham Forest and UEFA and that complaint, and that puts them in a slightly stronger position, but he hasn't signed a new deal. And you're absolutely right in what you say, that in previous windows, the price was seen as not necessarily astronomical because big money offers were placed, but difficult because even when Newcastle bid close to 65 and in January Spurs in and around the 70 mark, Palace were just turning it away. Now that's not expected to be the case unless he ends up signing a new deal. And the Guehi price could well be south of 50 million. I think from Palace's point of view, anything around that 50, even 55 with add-ons would be very difficult for them to turn down because they don't want to let his contract run and risk losing him on a free transfer. That money is very important to Crystal Palace. So there is now a realistic possibility that Guehi can be sold for a reasonable number. But it's not just about is 50, 55 a sort of bargain if you bid 65 a year ago or 70 in Spurs' perspective. There's also that value aspect. And I think that suitors will again be driving for a lower number if they bid for Guehi because of that contractual situation. So he's there and on Newcastle's list. I'm not aware of Spurs at this stage revisiting the deal. You got Chelsea who considered him in January as well. So I don't think we're going to get any extreme with Guehi. It will either be a contract renewal or he will end up being sold this summer, because I'd be surprised personally if Crystal Palace risk having that kind of valuation and ability to bring in money and decide it's better to just let him leave on a free transfer. But we shouldn't discount a new contract simply because Crystal Palace have got a feel-good factor. They've got European football at the moment. So let's see if anyone comes in for Guehi. But I think if you're going to get that deal done, again, at value, regardless of what the number, and value is based upon the fact that he's only got a year left of his contract, then it may be a slightly later in the window kind of deal, because right now Palace may be turning around and saying, we're going to use a bit of the window to see whether we can get him to sign a new deal. We're going to stick to a higher valuation this early in the window. So this might be one that Newcastle or Chelsea or whoever else is linked with him at the moment, fans may have to be a little bit patient on. I would be surprised if any team just swoops in and pays what it takes very early in the window, because Crystal Palace are going to be quite robust, I think, and quite strong in their negotiating at this stage. You've got Ilia Zabani as well at Bournemouth, who's another one that Newcastle really like. PSG are the ones really pushing for that deal at this stage. And it'll be interesting to see whether Bournemouth, for example, dig in now, because Dean Howson's gone to Real Madrid. And I don't think it's a case of Bournemouth won't lose other stars. They don't want them all to go, quite clearly, because they need to be able to back Andoni Iraola and hopefully get him to sign a new contract. But I think Zabani in particular is a difficult one because they've already lost Howson, whereas Semenya, if Bournemouth get a club record, we know Newcastle are linked with him as well. They might just sell him as long as they get more than Dominic Solanke, which I believe was 55 million and 10 million in add-ons. But Zabani means you lose Howson Zabani, and that's a double act, that's a partnership, that's chemistry, that's two players that you really relied on to give you those foundations. So that one's going to be very intriguing to me. And I think somebody, PSG perhaps, because they're the clear front runners, is going to really have to overpay for Zabani if they want that deal. Whereas Howson was probably done at value. Semenya in the current market at 55 million guaranteed fee, or maybe slightly more. Not a terrible price given the player's potential. And there's obviously others at Bournemouth that people are very interested, which is a compliment to how well they did last season. So Guehi to Newcastle, one possibility. Zabani's there on the list as well. But again, in the case of the latter, I think it's fair to say that PSG are more advanced. And if he goes, can be termed the favourites at this stage.
Okay, another one on my list, and I'm sure on many people's at home, is James Trafford, the Burnley goalkeeper. Newcastle linked heavily with him again in the last window. From our perspective, we've got a lot of goalkeepers, so you would imagine if Trafford did come in, or any keeper came in, there would at least one of the keepers would have to go out. What's your feelings on James Trafford to Newcastle?
Yeah, Newcastle and goalkeepers, they've gone through a phase of having too many, but not necessarily all the right ones in terms of the dynamic Eddie Howe's looking for. And that was why we know the Newcastle boss was really delighted that Martin Dubravka changed his mind about that Saudi move to Al-Shabaab in January. And there will be goalkeeper movement. I think it's as simple as that. And it's probably fair to say that James Trafford is the top choice. But again, coming back to what I said before, Newcastle United are looking for value. And unfortunately, with Burnley promoted and wanting to keep hold of Trafford in an ideal world, the price is even more expensive than it was when they were talking to Trafford 12 months ago. Newcastle were not prepared 12 months ago to go to 20 million with the right kind of structure. And now you're looking at 10, 15, maybe even closer to 20 million in terms of Burnley's valuation. There's a little bit of grandstanding here whereby, because they are newly promoted, again, early stage of the window, the number's quite high. I think as it goes on, the price will drop slightly, and there's still a very realistic chance that this deal gets done because Trafford wants the move. He's been guaranteed, if he joins, a fair amount of game time and obviously a reasonably quick path to becoming the number one at the club, even though Nick Pope is still there. So I think this one will remain one to watch because there's absolutely no denying that it's Newcastle's top choice. The links with Lucas Chevalier are also legit, but he's a different kind of goalkeeper with less, English know-how, if you like, and perhaps would be the kind of name that would have to wait a little bit longer to really start competing and being number one at the football club. Newcastle might not mind that because the Nick Pope situation, but I think if Trafford comes in, they'll feel very comfortable that they've got two goalkeepers that can immediately do that job as the number one. And then Eddie Howe has a welcome selection headache. So that's kind of where we stand on goalkeepers. I think that the Dubravka situation could be referred to as open simply because of his age. But from Eddie Howe's perspective, he wants to keep Dubravka. It's as simple as that. And he made that very clear in January that this is a player he values, will get some game time, maybe in things like the League Cup, but also off the field is extremely valuable and an important part of the goalkeepers group. I think the Odysseus situation of outgoings for goalkeepers is maybe the most interesting, because you've got a number 2, maybe even a number 3 in the pecking order that cost 20 million a year ago. And because of the PSR situation, you'll see a departure there, I think, but it will likely have to be a loan, because I don't see a scenario where Odysseus leaves permanently and Newcastle make anything other than a book loss. And that's why a loan might be preferable for all parties. If he leaves, then it's a PSR hit, because I'd be very surprised if they make more than 20 million on that deal. And that's roughly where we're at in the goalkeeper situation. It's a few moving parts, because does Dubravka, if another goalkeeper comes in, again change his mind and look for a new opportunity? But if it was up to Eddie Howe, regardless of the minutes that Dubravka gets, I'm told he would like to keep that goalkeeper at the club.
Okay, a lot of headlines this last couple of days about Joao Pedro, Brazilian, of course, would have a couple of compadres in Joe Linton and Bruno Guimaraes at Newcastle. Is that something that you think is a deal at Newcastle are chasing? Sorry.
Yeah, I think that Joao Pedro is very high in Newcastle's thinking, and at the time we're live, and I stress, because things change in windows, they're the only club that are actively in any sort of club-to-club talks, and we wait and see in terms of a bid, because Brighton don't go around quoting numbers. So you are kind of swinging in the dark a little bit. We hear some reports that say 50, other sources will say 60. There was that whole sort of incident with Van Hecker at the end of the season, but Brighton were very clear they've moved on from that. So they will be telling suitors that in an ideal world, they want to keep Joao Pedro, and clubs interested might be trying to play upon that uncertainty and that friction towards the end of the season to see if they can drive the price down. And we'll have to kind of wait and see. But we know that Brighton are very difficult to deal with, and the price may be a little bit higher than perhaps some of these clubs are thinking. But there's no doubt that Newcastle want to get that deal done, and likely will want to move quickly to avoid any surprises, because Chelsea are there, and Chelsea's interest is new. So in May, when Chelsea were looking at Liam Delap, a player that we know Newcastle held some kind of interest in, the Pedro links were largely overblown. There were no talks, there was no approach, they were not actively working on the deal. But then they got in Delap, and now Chelsea are starting to look at the kind of profile that they want in addition. And they don't want another Delap, because there is some faith in Nicholas Jackson. And this is kind of why Chelsea have moved on from a kind of Benjamin Sesko type profile. And now they're looking at the fact that Christopher Nkunku could leave, and they want a more versatile kind of attacker. And this is where suddenly they're thinking, maybe we should start thinking about Joao Pedro. And Mohamed Kudus was also offered to Chelsea by West Ham United. So unfortunately, these kind of transfers don't work in a linear way, and one club can do all the work and the other club can swoop in at the last minute, and suddenly it can be a head-to-head. So right now, it's Newcastle advancing, it's Newcastle holding all the talks, it's Newcastle doing all of the work. We wait and see whether they place a bid. And again, he's very high in Newcastle United's thinking. I think the player would be open to Newcastle United from what I hear. They've got Champions League football, great fan base, great club. So there's nothing stopping Pedro having his head turned by Newcastle United, but Chelsea might be there as well. We just have to wait and see, because they appreciate him very highly, but they haven't done all of that legwork yet. They haven't made that approach to Brighton in a formal sense yet. But the faster Newcastle move, the more Chelsea may be forced into making a decision earlier and decide if they want to go head-to-head with Newcastle. So there is always that danger that Chelsea enter this race. But right now, Newcastle are in a more advanced position. But that is just the window, unfortunately, that another club can realise they have to move simply because one team is making progress, and Chelsea will then decide if they want to enter that race. They could enter the race for Joao Pedro, but they've got other options. It's exactly the same situation with Chelsea and Mohamed Kudus as well.
Okay, another player is Nottingham Forest's Elanga. Again, somebody who has been linked with Newcastle in the past, and of course is good friends with Alexander Isak. What's your feelings on Elanga? Does he move in this window? And if he does, have Newcastle got a chance of potentially bringing him in?
Yeah, and Newcastle have obviously looked at Elanga before. Again, another player that they really liked. There was that window where it was Elanga and Jared Bowen that they were looking at concurrently, and Nottingham Forest were not at that point prepared to do any business. Now we have to wait and see if it's a slightly different situation, because Nottingham Forest haven't got Champions League and Newcastle United have. I think what they like about Elanga is that he can switch sides. So you've got a right-sided option and also the opportunity to move him on the left. And technically, he can lead the line as well. And he has that kind of explosivity and stamina. And he reminds me in many ways of Anthony Gordon, but on the right-hand side. Because if you look at the work that he does for Nottingham Forest, he can track back, he can defend, he can run from deep, he can do pretty much one-man counter-attacks. And that is a very Eddie Howe kind of player. And this is the profile that Newcastle are looking for, players that can run you out of trouble, that can stay wide but still give you attacking input because they're explosive enough to know when to cut inside and arrive in the box. And I think there's certainly legs to this one. Again, the challenge, I think, with Elanga might be price. If you look at another Newcastle target on that right-hand side in Semenya, as I said before, it's a bit of a clearer cut deal. It might be expensive, but it's absolutely obvious that if Bournemouth get a club record and that Dominic Solanke package that saw him go to Spurs is bettered, then there is a very fair chance that Bournemouth do business. And Bill Foley said on record that he won't unduly stand in a player's way. Dealing with Marinakis is a different story. And I think the valuation of Elanga might actually be higher than the valuation of Semenya. And this may be because Nottingham Forest are grandstanding and offering up a number that wards off the market. But I think Elanga may have to agitate a little bit for a move if this type of transfer is to go smoothly, simply because Marinakis and Bill Foley are two completely different kind of owners. Bournemouth have got a model. There's usually a number they'll sell for. Again, to stress and be respectful to Bournemouth, they don't want to lose all of their stars. So there is an element of concurrentness and who comes in for who first. Because after Howson leaves, like we said before, if it is Zabani to go, then they're not going to want to lose Semenya and Kluivert, for example. So you have a situation where people wanting to do business with Bournemouth will be aware it's not just about the single target, it's about who else goes where first. But there are clearer prices and Bournemouth are definitely easier to negotiate with. Whereas with Nottingham Forest, if Marinakis wakes up and decides Elanga is an 80 to 100 million pound player, then he may stick to that price right up until the end of the window, and it may become a little bit harder. And that's basically what happened 12 months ago when Newcastle were in for Elanga as well. But they definitely is high priority, bigger than the goalkeeper for now, because Nick Pope's still there, bigger than any other position where they're looking to strengthen, even the striker, because we know they're in talks that Callum Wilson could end up staying. The number one positional priority is that right-sided attacker or winger. And I would keep an eye on Elanga, and there is clear substance to the Semenya links as well.
Okay, links with Rashford today. What's your feelings about him? Potential loan deal? I can't see that happening.
Just doesn't feel like an Eddie Howe kind of player. I am not aware of Newcastle looking to strengthen on that left-hand side unless we get a slight surprise and it's Anthony Gordon that ends up leaving. There is concrete interest in him, we should say that. But Newcastle have obviously got a lot of cards because they've got a united squad. They've got a manager with a stable project. They've got Champions League football. So it's going to be difficult. But there is, of course, interest in Alexander Isak and Anthony Gordon. Whether or not that materializes into anything will all depend on Newcastle, of course. But I don't see them necessarily adding a left-sided attacker. And I know Rashford can play in more than one position. I don't see them prioritizing that left side unless you get an outgoing there, because Harvey Barnes finished the season in an outstanding way. Anthony Gordon, highly valued. And again, when fit and firing, nobody better, especially in this Eddie Howe system. So were they to add another left-sided attacker, I think you'd be looking at a younger kind of profile who maybe they send out on loan, maybe they could be more patient with. And, you know, they've already kind of had this mentality in this window. So, you know, to think of a more established player who is going to come straight in, expect minutes, be thrown into the starting lineup, and is a left-sided predominant attacker, doesn't add up with what I'm hearing. And it was the same with Jack Grealish as well. We heard a lot of Newcastle links. My understanding is that they're not looking at Grealish for exactly the same kind of reason. Big wage, a player that will only join if they think they're going to start every game. And can you guarantee that Marcus Rashford gets into this Newcastle United starting 11? I don't think you can. Are Newcastle going to sign a player, even if he takes a wage reduction, that is going to become the number one earner at the club and by quite some distance? I don't think they would go down that line. And is he an Eddie Howe kind of player? And that's not to say any disrespect to Rashford. Some players work under certain managers and systems and styles, and others don't. And I don't think he's a football fit. I don't think he's a financial fit. And I don't think he's a positional fit. So I would be surprised if this one develops. And I've personally not heard anything to suggest that Newcastle are thinking about entering the race for Marcus Rashford.
Okay, Marc Byers says, Ben, can you give some clarity on Paul Mitchell's situation after conflicting stories earlier this week? And are the club actively looking for a replacement, or are they going to go without one?
Yeah, I think that they'll hire somebody. Whether or not that becomes a like-for-like profile and position remains to be seen. There's a lot of respect for the internal people that are currently part of the recruitment team at the moment and part of the sports science team. I think in the past I've mentioned James Bunce and how important he is as performance director. And that was somebody that Paul Mitchell brought in. So we shouldn't discount the fact that Mitchell has built something. We might not have seen it translate into window-on-window transfer business in the short stint that he's been there. But behind the scenes, he's still kind of changed the culture of recruitment and sports science and performance away from how Dan Ashworth ran things. And I think at the end of the day, the fact that he's staying on until the end of this month tells you that this isn't in any way acrimonious. This is about Mitchell building foundations and then leaving. And it'll be very interesting to see what he does next. I think in terms of finding a replacement, we'll kind of have to wait and see, because you may remember that when Mitchell got the job, they ran a very thorough process, and a lot of the candidates involved in that process, because so little time has passed, would still be the candidates that they would want to bring in. And yet many of them are either now unavailable or in other jobs. So the other leading contender at the time was Johannes Spoors, and he's now at Southampton and new to Southampton and a group technical director rather than just a sporting director. And that's what I mean, that if Newcastle are going to eventually go down the route of multi-club, if Newcastle are going to change their model, then whoever they bring in could, in theory, carry a different title. But they will bring in another kind of recruitment lead for sure, because somebody's got to pick up the Mitchell slack. One name that was looked at, as I think said on here, or certainly other podcasts at the time, was Pablo Longoria, who used to be at Newcastle as a scout. And again, I don't see any possibility where he would entertain. And I think they reached out to Longoria and he was very respectful because of his affiliation with Newcastle. But I think he said, look, I don't want to engage because Marseille is my club. He has a role that isn't sporting director. He's president. So again, you have a very different kind of perspective there. And he would be very difficult to get. And I don't even think that Longoria would want to hold the talks with Newcastle, knowing that he holds a higher position at a very prestigious club who have got De Zerbi and have now got Champions League football. But again, that was a kind of name that Newcastle thought of. And I think you don't approach Longoria, even though it led to nothing, unless you perhaps are thinking about that name as carrying more weight than only sporting director, which means even 12 months ago, they were perhaps looking at people, the same with Johannes Spoors, because at that point he was group sporting director at 777. So these names have a kind of pattern. Mitchell, big experience working in Europe and a club that's able to generate a lot of income. And then the other two that are bigger than just sporting directors. So let's kind of see what direction they go. Are they going to sort of try for a Michael Edwards type CEO of football? Are they going to stick with a sporting director? Are they going to bring in someone that's a bit more fluent in European football and think about a potential pathway to multi-club eventually? That's an interesting debate. And I think the clue to who they hire next maybe will show you a little bit the direction of the travel with the model as well. But I'm not aware that anyone's been offered the job yet. You have also, in terms of sort of Premier League experience, still links with Phil Giles too, who's a Newcastle United fan. He was another name that they looked at before they hired Paul Mitchell. So I think in terms of the next change that they make, a lot of the candidates are going to be very similar to a year ago, because unfortunately Paul Mitchell's time at the football club hasn't been very long. But I would be surprised if they don't bring in some form of replacement, because it feels like even though they back the internal people that they've got, they are now one short and one senior person short within that recruitment model.
Jack asks, Ben, you were really accurate about PSR situation last year when everyone was claiming we had £200 million and you said we had issues. What is your understanding of our PSR situation now? And I'll follow that up with John's question, which is, are clubs like Liverpool and Man City trying to disrupt Newcastle by leaking stories about us for Isak and Tino when we know they aren't for sale?
Yeah, the first point is I'm not aware that Newcastle are in a particular bind. I think it's Villa and possibly Bournemouth that are going to have to look at sales in the next few weeks, and it would be interesting to see whether or not we have any kind of mirrored deals, separate deals, whatever you want to call them, in the next 2 weeks. They were a fad, weren't they, 12 months ago? And now we haven't seen any of them so far, but there's sort of 2 weeks or so before the financial year ends, and there's a near miss period into early July as well. So we're probably looking at 3 or 4 weeks now where, for those clubs needing sales to satisfy their PSR positions, this is the period where we might see a flurry of business. With Newcastle, I think they're okay. Champions League football, and they oversatisfied in many ways the PSR position 12 months ago because of the fact that they sold Yakuba Minta and Elliot Anderson, and that allowed them not to have to sell Anthony Gordon to Liverpool. So if they do need to bring in more funds, and obviously Almiron's left as well, and Callum Wilson has a new offer, but if he leaves, you're getting another reasonably high wage off the books. So I think Newcastle are okay. And I'm not aware that they're scrambling for sales like they were 12 months ago. But with incomings, what you might see is them just wait to put that outlay into July. So a lot of people are asking me about why Arsenal haven't moved and why Tottenham haven't moved and why Newcastle haven't put any big outlay out yet, even though they've got Champions League football, and yet Liverpool are signing Wirtz and Chelsea have signed Delap, and obviously Man City have been very busy as well. And I think with Chelsea and Man City, they were always going to be active because they both have Champions League football and they're both at the Club World Cup. So you want to bring in those players ideally and have them part of your group for that tournament. And I just think Liverpool are the Premier League winners, and they've kind of stockpiled money because remember, they put 100-odd million down for Caicedo. He joined Chelsea. They put 50 million down for Romeo Lavia. He joined Chelsea. They had money allocated for Jude Bellingham, but then they pulled out of that race and he joined Real Madrid. So Liverpool have kind of saved their pocket money and are just moving in their own direction and timescale because of the fact that they don't have to worry about the PSR situation in this window. I think with Newcastle and Arsenal and Tottenham, they'll do deals in July, not because they have concerns about not being PSR compliant this summer, but because they want to put that outlay into the next financial year. And this is why maybe some teams appear like they've not got going yet, when actually it's just a bit warped because we've not been in this 1st to the 10th of June window before that opened ahead of the Club World Cup. And it paints a picture that some clubs are active and others aren't. But if you didn't have that window, then we'd be 3 days into the summer window, and the European window for teams in La Liga, for example, wouldn't have even opened. And no one would be saying we're slow. People would just be saying we're 3 days in the window. And if you do a deal tomorrow, it'd feel like, oh, we're busy, we're active, we're early. But because of the fact that you've had that extra bit of window and early, a few fans of a few clubs are saying, why are we doing nothing? And I just think it's the fact that Newcastle are looking at this summer window as now, as opening on the 16th, not really opening on the 1st, even though they've had a little bit of activity. But yeah, I don't think there's a PSR bind. I don't think there's a number that they desperately need. And I don't think they'll be forced into any kind of outgoings. So then coming on to the potential exits of bigger stars, I think there's two things.
Barry's asked a question there about Willock and Longstaff. Yeah,
I mean, look, Longstaff's definitely a player that can go. I know that there's a few clubs that are interested in him. I'm not aware yet of suitors for Willock, but again, another possibility. But I think Eddie Howe really likes him as well. But with Longstaff, he's entering the final 12 months of his deal. He had opportunities in January. He didn't take them. He's only 27 years of age. There's a few clubs interested. Leeds United are one of them. Everton have looked in the past as well. And there is a possibility that he departs. And part of it, again, will be about Longstaff. And does he want an opportunity where he can play every single week? Or is he prepared to be part of this squad? Because if he says to Eddie Howe, I want to run out my contract, I think he'll be allowed to leave on his own terms. But again, if he feels it's better to play every week as opposed to be part of a Champions League squad, but maybe get limited minutes, then there may be a situation where he may leave. And Leeds in particular are the one to keep an eye on, as I broke a few weeks ago, and their interest hasn't gone away. So he could depart. But when we come back to the second part of that question, and, you know, we're going to go round and round in circles, I think, for much of the window here until these players either sign new deals or Newcastle make a definitive statement, which is not the norm to do via club channels. So that's not what I'm expecting. But we saw Darren Eales do an interview speaking about holding on to the stars and it being counterproductive for them to leave. So maybe that's what will happen during pre-season. Perhaps we'll hear an executive say something about these names, or in the case of Isak, maybe we'll see a new deal being signed. But the reality of the situation is, even though it irritates Newcastle fans, you can have both a Newcastle position of not wishing to sell and still interested clubs trying. And you can have both Newcastle saying, we will not sell, and clubs saying, we think that there is a number where you will sell. And virtually every player eventually has a price, right? But once again, it's not just about these individual names with Newcastle, it's also about the collective names. So if there was a hypothetical scenario where they said one of our players has a price, whoever that player may be, then it becomes very, very unlikely, if not impossible, that another name will go. So one day you may hear a story about Gordon, one day you may hear a story about Isak, one day you may hear a story about Bruno, one day you hear a story about Tino, one day you hear a story about Botman. If one of those names went, then it becomes highly, highly unlikely that Newcastle would allow any of the other names to go. But is there a possibility that one big star exits at the right price, at what Newcastle would consider an astronomical number? Absolutely. But what is that number? It remains to be seen, because apart from Tino Livramento and Manchester City, we've not yet really had any formal approaches. So if we kind of take them one by one, Liverpool haven't given up on Alexander Isak. They would be prepared to smash a British transfer record. That is true, but they haven't made that offer yet. And if they do, are Newcastle going to turn it down? I think their perspective may be yes, but that doesn't mean that Liverpool won't try. And I think when we report that as journalists, it always gets taken out of context, because immediately people will go, Ben Jacobs says Liverpool are prepared to smash the British transfer record for Alexander Isak. When actually what Ben Jacobs said is Liverpool haven't given up on Alexander Isak, and we have to respect the Newcastle position. So are Liverpool in a position with that kind of money to go for Isak after Wirtz? Yes. Is Isak their dream target? Yes. Would they like to get it over the line? Yes. Will they try? We'll now have to wait and see. And by try, I mean in a formal sense. Will they actually come and test the waters, whether verbally or formally? And then what's Newcastle's position? And does Isak, like any other player, have a number? Is that British transfer record? Is that, as sources imply, and I reported yesterday, well over 150 million? Is it even 200 million? And there'll come a point where every player has a number. But naturally, if that number's so astronomical, you're using that number to ward off the market, and it's a no-brainer. Similarly, is Isak welcoming of the links and the genuine interest? Of course, because it gives him maximum leverage to then potentially go back to Newcastle and get a new deal. And that's kind of where we're at Isak. There's a lot of noise because the interest is genuine, but Newcastle's position has to be respected. And were he to go, it would be for astronomical money. and clubs would have to find that. And there may well be a scenario where after all of this noise and all of this genuine interest, it just ends up being Newcastle who have got all the cards saying, let's offer him a new deal. And remember, even if he doesn't sign a new deal, he's well contracted. There's Champions League football. So you can never say never in a transfer window. But the reality of the situation is that Newcastle have got a lot of cards. And yet at the same time, Liverpool and Arsenal still have that genuine interest. With Anthony Gordon, there's a bit more history because Newcastle nearly did that deal when Newcastle were in a PSR bind. And I think if Minter hadn't gone to Brighton and Anderson hadn't gone to Nottingham Forest, then they might have had to sell Anthony Gordon. And we know that his head was turned at the time. But I don't think that Liverpool would move for Anthony Gordon unless Luis Diaz leaves. And they told Barcelona 2 weeks ago they want to keep Luis Diaz. If Saudi come in for Luis Diaz with astronomical money, you have a situation where maybe Liverpool move. Anthony Gordon's on Arsenal's list as well. And again, I repeat what I said before because things always get taken out of the context, how sometimes you report them, that we can talk about Liverpool and Arsenal and Gordon. We can talk about Arsenal and Liverpool for Isak, but it feels like it's either neither or one or the other. So once again, people will go away and say, Liverpool want Gordon, Liverpool want Isak, Arsenal would love Isak, Arsenal would like Gordon. They're obviously not going to sell both of them, especially to the same club in the same window. Are they going to sell either? Maybe not as well. But is there a chance that crazy money for one of them talks and they do a deal? You never know, because that's the unpredictability of the window. And that's why Liverpool haven't given up on Isak. And that's why you still have Gordon on clubs' radars. But it's not a case of both. With Bruno Guimaraes, he feels quite happy at Newcastle United. Manchester City have tried in the past, again, around the last PSR deadline. They asked whether anything was possible at 80 million to find out the severity of Newcastle's PSR buying 12 months ago. But you look at kind of Bruno and how he reacted when Newcastle won the League Cup. You look at the demeanour of the player. You look at how he's Geordie through and through. And that one feels more unlikely, I think, whereas Gordon did genuinely have his head turned by Liverpool 12 months ago. I think Bruno Guimaraes has done quite well to ignore a lot of the noise and only focus on Newcastle United. Tino Livramento feels untouchable because they've built this Livramento, Lewis Hall type situation. We know there's a bit of a question mark over the long-term future of Kieran Trippier. He's had interest from Turkey in previous windows. So I feel like it's a different scenario because Livramento was signed on a steal and has been outstanding. And I just don't see the club wanting to engage or sanction anything, allowing them to give up such a young and talented fullback that could be part of this project for several years to come. And I think Manchester City again inquired with genuine interest to see if anything was possible, and it was shut down very quickly. So I don't see him departing. I think the same can be said for Sven Botman. You might end up spending more money in that position, replacing Sven Botman, even if actually the income that you're bringing in appears quite good, which is why I think Newcastle will rebuff interest there. And that's probably the difference, right? That were you to sell Isak or Gordon for astronomical type money, then you would be able to replace them and still pocket something. But again, nobody's saying that Newcastle are doing that. So I repeat once again, because half of what we report is sometimes put out there as a headline, and you think, wait a minute, nobody listened to the context of what was actually said. Clubs being interested, clubs trying, clubs feeling like there's a number, clubs not wanting to give up, doesn't mean that Newcastle's position shouldn't be respected. And that may still be, we'll have the conversation with you. You can make as many bids as you like, but unless you're going to be giving us that 150, 200 million number, we're not going to be entertaining it for these kind of players. So it's fascinating, and it's the beauty of the window. But this isn't about games or disruption. The interest from the suitors is genuine. And now we have to wait and see whether Newcastle, as they did with Tino Livramento, shut it down, whether they quote an astronomical number. And if that number's quoted, whether anyone's actually prepared to pay it. And if they're not, then those players are just going to remain at Newcastle United. I don't think in football, even people I speak to at Newcastle can definitively say that none of these stars will leave, because sometimes money can talk. But do they want to keep them? Yes. Do they intend to keep them? Yes. Are they going to be incredibly difficult to negotiate if somebody tries? Yes. And is the end resolution that they want to keep absolutely every name that we've mentioned? Of course. So that all leads to a not for sale stance. But as we know in football, money can talk. Florian Wirtz was not for sale at one point. He joined Liverpool. Moises Caicedo was not for sale at one point. He left British transfer record and joined Chelsea. So things can change. But as I say, you have to respect Newcastle's position, because in these kind of negotiations, if they develop, they hold all of the cards.
Love it. We've got to go because Ben's got to get a bus off to Chelsea's fixture. We are going to get Ben back on at the end of July. Ben, take care. Have a good day today, and I'll keep in touch. See you at the end of July, mate.
Look forward to it. Always a pleasure, mate. Speak soon.
Bye-bye. Big thanks to Ben for coming on, as always. Top man. He gets a lot of stick online, and, all he does is come on and give his opinion, which is all I do and all anybody does on NUFC Matters. If you've enjoyed what you watched today, please just hit the subscribe button. It is free. We do 7 shows a week. Back tomorrow night. Those were the days. We're looking back with George on last season. Part 1, 6 o'clock tomorrow night. Saturday night, 5 o'clock, we are live with the Amigos. And on Sunday night, we are live with the professionals again at 5 o'clock. Have a good day. Enjoy the sun. Get the cream on your napper. Take care. A big thanks to all our sponsors, Skips and Bins. You can find them at their website, skipsandbins.com. Contact them at www.skipsandbins.com/contact. Say hello to low-cost waste disposal with pay-as-you-go and contract waste management. A big thanks to Mr. Vicky Sauces, handmade in Cumbria. You can find them at their website, mrvickies.co.uk, email info@mrvickies.co.uk, or telephone 01768 210 102. Thanks to our fanzine sponsor, United Group Travel. There are no strangers on our tours, just friends you haven't met yet. 2 crew driver and courier, local family company, 3-star plus quality hotels and no interchanges. Hot and cold snacks and drinks available on the coach. All excursions included. Their website, unitedgrouptravel.com, email beverly.ugtl@gmail.com, telephone 01670 632 460 or 0791 666 4174. Just £30 per person deposit. Thanks to Media Arts for all the help with the technical side of things. And if you like listening to us as a podcast, you can go to Sports Social Podcast Network or to iTunes, Spotify, or other podcast providers. If you want to support the show, then hit the subscribe button. It's free. We do 7 shows a week. Hit the little thumb up under the video, which is the like button, or click share to share to your social media. You can also join the channel on YouTube by hitting the join button for as little as $1.99 a month. If you want to become an NUFC Matters member, you can go to nufcmatters.co.uk. It's a £25 one-off fee. You get your pen, you get your badge, a key ring, you get your beer mat and your fridge magnet and your membership card, nufcmatters.co.uk for that. And we have an event early next year, 13th of February 2026, an evening with Beardsley, Waddle and Gascoigne takes place at the Tyne Theatre and Opera House. To buy your tickets for that event, go to the box office 0191 243 1171 or Tyne Theatre and Opera House.uk.